Creepy aspects of Victorian life. Welcome back viewers to our channel where we explore the fascinating and sometimes eerie aspects of history. In today's video, we will be delving into the dark and mysterious world of Victorian life. From unusual customs to haunting rituals, the Victorian era was filled with creepy aspects that will send shivers down your spine. So, without further ado, let's begin our countdown of the top 10 creepy aspects of Victorian life. Death photography. The Victorians were a little bit obsessed with death. Sounds messed up, but it makes sense when you consider the smorgasbord of diseases that stalked Victorians. Measles, scarlet fever, diphtheria, rubella, typhus, and cholera. It was a sort of gauntlet of death that children and adults alike ran through every day. Those very real threats and sense of loss led to people keeping memento mori, Latin for, remember you must die, trinkets, like locks of hair and photos of the dead. Remember that photographs were still a fairly technology, and they were only starting to become affordable in the mid-1800s. As such, it was often only when something tragic happened that people would think to immortalize their loved ones in photographs. That gave rise to the seriously creepy trend of death photography. The bodies were often kept at home for the mourning period, and photographs were staged with not just the deceased, but their parents or siblings, sometimes posing as if everyone were still alive. Children sat with their dead parent, parents held their dead children. You get the idea. Child emigrations. If you've ever seen any Victorian period piece, you've seen the adorable but filthy children that live in the streets, picking pockets and causing a general sort of trouble. The plight of orphan children was very real, and according to writer and historian Sarah Wise, via Spittlefield's Life, estimates suggest that there were around 30,000 children were living on the London streets in 1869. Wealthy philanthropists took up the cause, including Miss Annie Macpherson. Macpherson set up some schools to teach the kids useful skills, but the problem soon became overwhelming. So she changed gears and became a champion of the disturbing practice of emigration. Kids were pulled off the streets and out of workhouses to be shipped overseas to British colonies. Many ended up laboring as farm help or working as domestic servants, and by 1904 Macpherson alone had sent 12,000 children to Canada. The Maritime Archives and Library of the National Museums Liverpool says children were also sent to Australia and New Zealand, and between 1870 and 1914, 80,000 kids were sent just to Canada. The supposed causes of mental illness were insane. According to Cornwall's Bodmin Hospital, the population of England's insane asylums skyrocketed through the 19th century. Apparently most of the patients fell under three labels: the manic, the melancholic, and those with dementia. The symptoms of those diagnosed with the big three varied, and they weren't the only messed up reasons you could be committed. Nor was England the only place that went a little crazy with all the crazy. West Virginia's Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum's records of common causes of mental illness for patients admitted between 1864 and 1889 reads like either a college student's to-do list or a really good Friday night. On their list were offenses like laziness, novel reading, superstition, an immoral life, and intemperance, along with every single kind of self-pleasure you can imagine. Women weren't left out, either, and there are some equally bizarre possible causes of mental illness. Those include things like imaginary female trouble and hysteria, along with rumor of husband murder and fits and desertion of husband. You could make a living as a grave robber. We can all agree it's better that medical students learn on cadavers before they start poking around inside living humans, but Victorian-era schools were faced with a problem. Historic UK says that the only bodies they could legally dissect were those that had belonged to someone who had been executed for a crime, and in 1823, Britain passed a law that made fewer crimes end in the death penalty. Doctors in training still needed to learn, and that meant they needed to get their cadavers somewhere else. That somewhere else was the cemetery, and if you want some seriously grim reading you can find it in the Diary of a Resurrectionist. Written by James Blake Bailey of the Royal College of Surgeons of England, he gives a great insight into the everyday life of a resurrectionist, the label given to the people who dug people out of their graves. Not only did they get a price for each one, but they were also given a fee to be kept on retainer and a fee after a successful delivery. A beauty routine included things like ammonia, arsenic, and lead. Standards of beauty might change from generation to generation. But Victorian beauty routines read like something out of a chemistry textbook. Specifically the part near the back where they list all the stuff that'll kill you. Harper's Bazaar ran a column called, The Ugly Girl Papers, or, Hints for the Toilet, via Atlas Obscura. It offered practical beauty advice, but today we'd recognize it as being insanely dangerous. White skin was all the rage, and women achieved that by washing their faces with ammonia, then covering them with lead-based paint. And don't think you could get away with going bare-faced at night, either, because in order to keep that fresh-faced look, the column suggested rubbing some opium on before bed. For those who were really committed, Sears and Roebuck sold a product called Dr. Campbell's Safe Arsenic Complexion Wafers. Yes, it was arsenic, and yes, women were instructed to eat them. If you were unlucky enough to have thin eyebrows and eyelashes, a nightly smear of mercury could help with that. And speaking of eyes, watery eyes were all the rage, too. For some reason. To achieve that look, women could use lemon juice, perfume, or belladonna as eye drops. The latter did, of course, cause blindness, but people have been suffering for beauty for ages. Divorce wasn't a thing, so men sold unwanted wives. Divorce wasn't allowed in England until the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, but people have been having marital difficulties for as long as they've been getting married. Since you couldn't just sign some papers and be on your merry way, people needed to find another way out. As a result, wife selling became a completely legitimate way to get out of a marriage, and it continued well through the 19th century, particularly in rural Britain. According to research done by Lauren Paget from Leeds Trinity University, wife sales could happen in public or in private. But the public sales were quite the spectacle. The husband typically put some kind of lead rope on his unwanted wife, took her to a public square, and asked for offers. Sort of like eBay, but with your wife instead of an old smartphone. Records suggest that the wife had veto power over the sale, and sometimes it was for cash. Prices varied. One wife was sold in Selby in 1862 for a pint of beer, while others seem to have gone for a decent amount of cash. Corpse medicine was still a thing. Corpse medicine is exactly what it sounds like, and for hundreds of years people believed that consuming certain parts of the human body was a miracle cure for whatever ailed them. A popular prescribed cure-all was human skull, and, when mixed with chocolate, it was believed to treat apoplexy. Corpse medicine was at its height in the 16th and 17th centuries, but Smithsonian Magazine says it persisted well into the Victorian era. Medical texts specify which morsels are good for which ailments, and there were recipe books that explained how to prepare the pieces, too. One text from 1847 prescribes a bit of skull, specifically, the skull of a young woman, mixed with treacle as a treatment for epilepsy. Executioners were often linked to corpse medicine, and it wasn't uncommon for them to do double duty as bringer of death and healer of the poor, selling pints of warm blood from very recent clients. Look on the bright side. You might hate your doctor, but at least he'll send you to a pharmacist instead of a hanging to get your medicine. Mummies were used for all kinds of disturbing things. The whole 19th century was defined by a messed-up British obsession with all things Egyptian, and you can still see the traces of Egyptomania reflected in the era's architecture. Mummies were front and center when it came to the Victorians' weird fetish, and it wasn't enough to do something normal like put them in a museum. According to the Journal of Art and Society, paintmakers used ground-up mummies as one of the ingredients in brown paint, aptly named Mummy Brown. It was hugely popular throughout the Victorian era, even though some people thought turning mummies into paint was wrong while others said it made for poor quality paint, because priorities. There were other weird things mummies were used for, too. In 2007, a forensic scientist tested the contents of a jar found in 1867 in a Victorian-era Paris pharmacy, via the BBC. The label identified the contents as the remains of Joan of Arc, and while that seemed unlikely, the test results found something even more unlikely. It was made of mummy, dating back to some time between the 3rd and 7th centuries BC. It was likely prepared, not long before it was found. They were also used as advertising draws. In 1886, a mummy said to be the very same pharaoh's daughter who had saved the life of baby Moses was put on display in a candy store in Chicago. Because there's nothing quite like a mummy watching you as you pick out your bonbons and lollies. Food additives were insane. When we start talking about the worst things you could find in the foodstuffs of Victorian England, we're not even going to get into sanitation, aside from saying it wasn't uncommon for bakers to knead dough using their feet, because that needs a mention. Let's talk about the stuff they used to put into food on purpose. The Royal Society of Chemistry says food safety and industry regulation really got its start in the Victorian era, thanks to the tendency to use potentially deadly additives. Chalk and alum were sometimes added to dough to make bread whiter, and it wasn't unheard of to have things like pipe clay, plaster of Paris, or sawdust added to the mix. Brewers sometimes added strychnine to their beer so they could cut back on hops, and lead was all over. Professor Anthony S. Wohl of Vassar College says red lead was used to color Gloucester cheese, and lead was added to cider, mustard, wine, sugars, and candies. Copper sulfates were used in preserving fruit, jams, and wine. Mercury was used in candies. And let's talk about ice cream, which University of Tasmania professor Dr. Bruce Rosen says got popular in the 1880s. The stuff you'd get on the street sometimes wasn't made with milk, but just a water and chalk mixture. As if you didn't have enough to worry about with all the cholera, typhoid, and diphtheria. Your food was just making it worse. Amelia Dyer and the baby farmers. At the time, most people were a little shaky on how not to get pregnant, and when they did, it could be the stuff of life-changing ruin. An entire group of women made a living taking care of these unwanted children or acting as brokers to get them into happy homes, for a fee. Some were loving people who legitimately helped mother and baby. Others, not so much. There's headline after headline detailing the death counts attributed to the worst of the baby farmers, women who would take the child and their fee for finding him or her a new home. And then just off the baby. Trials would cite counts of dozens of infanticides, and one of the worst was Amelia Dyer, who provided her services to desperate mothers for more than 30 years. According to the BBC, she charged the equivalent of $10,000 in today's cash, and at the time of her capture took in an average of 6 babies every day. She was convicted after the body of Helena Fry was fished out of the Thames, and she admitted to police everyone strangled with tape was one of mine. It's not known how many she killed, but the number is certainly in the hundreds. Theater stampedes, fires, and deaths. You can't go into any public building without seeing emergency exits and maximum capacity signs. But safety hadn't been invented in the Victorian era, and it was a string of tragedies that made people decide something needed to be done to keep this from happening. In 1876, the Brooklyn Theatre burned, along with 278 people, after a lantern fell over on stage. There was nothing wrong with the building by the standards of the time, but when fire and panic both broke out, people trying to flee were trapped in a staircase. According to Atlas Obscura, 103 were never identified, but the public outpouring of grief was so great a monument was erected over a mass gravesite. The worst was arguably the Victoria Hall disaster of 1883. Around 2,000 children, most 7 to 11 years old, crowded into Victoria Hall to see some traveling entertainers. At the end, the group announced children with certain numbers on their tickets would be given prizes, and the ensuing stampede trapped children in the stairwells. It took half an hour to dislodge the crowd, and 183 kids were deceased. Smithsonian Magazine says it was this tragedy that sparked the invention of the push-bar emergency exit. But this simple, life-saving invention wasn't immediately implemented, at a massive cost. Thank you for joining us on this spine-chilling journey through history. If you found this video intriguing, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating explorations into the mysterious past. Until next time, stay curious, and embrace the eerie side of history.